Tonight, I want to look, as the title indicates, at not only the history of the Federation and the Federation attempts, not only since the 1950s, but many attempts in various forms previous to that. I wish to dedicate tonight's lecture to the memory of C.L.R. James, a distinguished son of Trinidad and the Caribbean, and one of the greatest minds that this region has produced. Not for the life of him could he have run a country or put his philosophies into practice like his colleague and sometime adversary, Dr. Eric Williams, did. But he has left a body of work to inspire and stimulate future generations of Caribbean people, and indeed any former colonial societies of this planet. I was incredibly lucky, back in 1981, to attend one of his last public lectures. It was a dramatic affair, filmed for the fledgling Channel 4 television company in the United Kingdom. James entered the small lecture hall at the Commonwealth Institute in London wearing an outfit entirely of blue. A wide-brimmed hat worthy of one of Trinidad Carnival's characters, the Midnight Robber, and a long flowing cape. As he shuffled towards his seat, he swept off the hat, swung off the cape, and after a brief introduction by the chairman, launched into his lecture. He had no written speech, he had no notes, and he spoke with unbroken fluidity for 45 minutes. I, like everybody else in the room, was galvanized by the performance. In the question and answer session afterwards, I tackled him on some detail of contemporary Caribbean reality on which I thought he had been in error. C.L.R. dismissed this mere detail with imperious disdain, for he laid out his philosophies in broad, abstract brushstrokes. The practical details were for somebody else to attend to. It was in the spirit of the idea that mattered. I confess the main strands of my presentation tonight may share that abstract nature somewhat. And Professor Brereton mentioned about my interest in the pre-Columbian people. And I want to begin with a reference in Columbus's log on his first voyage to a meeting in Hispaniola with some of the Taino people. Hispaniola and the surrounding Greater Antilles, of course, had greater resources than the small islands down south to the east. And they were therefore able to develop far superior societies with ball courts and various types of hierarchical government. And when he asked them about other islands, they referred to these wild small islands down below where these people came and attacked places like Puerto Rico, etc. And it was simply because of the different resources that were available that different development patterns emerged during that pre-Columbian era. Set that aside and just remember that some of these elements of over 500 years ago are issues which we deal with today in attempting to unify the Caribbean. The small islands in relation to the large. In August 1962, Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago became the first two colonies in the English-speaking Caribbean to gain independence. Since then, another 13 former British colonies in the Anglophone Caribbean, culminating with St. Kitts and Nevis in 1983, have joined the ranks of independent states. This year, while both Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago celebrate 50 years of independence, it is largely ignored more widely in the Caribbean that the event which precipitated their move to nationhood was the collapse of the Federation of the West Indies. When I was first asked to deliver a lecture by the Answer McCall Foundation, the topic was left open. It was only after I had chosen my theme and that it had been publicized that I realized that in 2008, the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus had hosted a lecture series on the 50th anniversary of the commencement of the Federation. The series was addressed by a number of distinguished academics, not least of them being Sir Sridath Ramphal, who was actually involved and witnessed many aspects of the Federation as a young man. And as he admits, there are few of those fortunate persons still around today. With that excellent series having incisively covered details of the Federation itself, what I wish to do this evening is to look at the independent Anglophone Caribbean at the 50th anniversary of the disintegration of the Union and critically assess the realities ahead. These range from politics to social change, new economic groupings, communications, food security, environmental issues, and energy. And I will question the whole idea, the whole mirage of unity itself. This combination, some would say this conflict, of the building and collapse of a union and its splintering into independence, followed years later by efforts to build it back together again, and it provides an important benchmark for this assessment. Having said that, we still require a brief review of the Federation experiment so as to refresh the memories of those who are old enough to have been witnesses to it and to inform those here who probably were born a couple decades after the event. This will show that there are perennial issues which have haunted the enterprise from the very beginning and seem unlikely to go away. The first step towards political unity in the English-speaking Caribbean by Caribbean people themselves, without the intervention of the colonial authorities, was taken in Dominica 80 years ago this past week. On the 28th of October, 1932, the Dominica Conference, considering West Indian Confederation and self-government, was opened at the St. Gerard's Hall in Roseau. 17 delegates, comprising some of the most progressive West Indian leaders of the day, met to discuss and plan the future of the region. For the first time, this was not a meeting organized by the British colonial government. It was entirely a West Indian initiative. The ideas presented by these pioneer regional nationalists were passionate and idealistic. In the circumstances, it was understandably so. For those delegates who were members of island legislative councils had experienced the frustration and senselessness of Crown colony rule in the 20th century West Indies. Now they were West Indians with the education, determination, and ability to manage their own affairs, and the conference itself proved this without doubt. In the words of the conference chairman, Cecil Rawle of Dominica, whose parents were Trinidadians, he said, and I quote, "Let us hope that ultimately there will arise in our islands a self-governing dominion worthy to take its place in the councils of the empire. We are going to seek to remedy the grievances we speak of, not by the method of the assassin, nor by arson, nor by other acts of violence of any kind, but by constitutional methods, relying on the righteousness of our cause. And if the people of the West Indies are united and determined, if they do not get frightened at the mere term self-government, if we stand together and march together, boldly demanding our rights as British citizens, refusing to be regarded any longer as political outcasts, our cause will conquer in the end." In quoting this, let us understand that in those days, West Indian nationalists saw their future within the context of an enduring British Empire. They may have been radicals of a sort in their day, but they were also empire loyalists. This was the world that they knew, the perception with which they had been brought up. This was their reality at that time. Men such as Captain Cipriani had fought in a war which propaganda had claimed was a war to end all wars for the freedom of the world. However, it is now argued, as journalist Seamus Milne has pointed out in a recent article in the British newspaper The Guardian, and I quote, "This wasn't a war of self-defense, let alone liberation from tyranny. As the late Eric Hobsbawm sets out in his Age of Empire, it was a cataclysmic product of an escalating struggle for colonial possessions. Markets, resources, and industrial power between the dominant European empires, Britain and France, and the rising imperial power of Germany seeking its place in the sun. In that clash of empires, Europe devoured its children and many of its captured peoples with them," unquote. Those such as Captain Cipriani, who did return from that war, were changed men, the horror and discrimination he had witnessed against the loyal West Indies volunteers had stripped him of much of his rose-tinted concepts about British patterns of leadership and government. But his belief in being part of a brotherhood welded together under the aegis of a world power, whose philosophy of government rested on ideals born of the 18th century age of Enlightenment, remained intact, as it did for others of that generation. As Gordon Lewis has written about the pioneer Trinidadian nationalist of the late 19th century, J.J. Thomas, he refers to the fact that Thomas, an educated colonial, like everybody else in the long Pax Britannica of the Victorian age, almost seemed to believe that the British Empire would continue forever and that he would work within the confines of that framework. The radicalism of C.L.R. James was that he dismissed loyalty to empire as part of his equation. So it is within this context that we must view the ideals of these West Indian pioneers at the Dominica Conference, and those who molded and participated later in the brief Federation of the West Indies. It was an exercise steeped in Enlightenment principles and ideals. Plans for the operation of a general government of the West Indies were outlined, but there was a sharp divergence on how voting for the federal representatives should be conducted. Eventually, a compromise was reached, and the conference only supported full adult franchise, the right for all to vote without qualifications, as an ultimate aim of a new West Indies federation. It suggested that every colony should conduct its voting as each local legislature saw fit. This uneven system was obviously unfair and unworkable, and it was one of the main causes of Theophilus Albert Marichaud's rejection of the conference report. The acknowledged father of West Indian Federation continued to distrust any federal propositions not clearly based on the universal vote. In the words of Rawle, they had been powerless to mold policy, and what the conference demanded first was that the islands should have internal self-government within the British Commonwealth of Nations. The spirit of the Dominica Conference of 1932 lingers on today in CARICOM, and as I shall point out, perhaps more strongly in the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. The idea of federation was by no means new. As colonies, islands had been administered in groups from time to time during the 18th and 19th centuries. At the inception of the European colonial adventure, the possession and administration of islands had been carved up, divided by treaties, mere pawns in the power game of empire. In 1763, the Union of the Southern Caribbean Islands, which included Tobago, was established only to collapse into separate colonies 7 years later. In 1781, for instance, Britain only held 3 islands in the Caribbean: Jamaica, Barbados, and Antigua. And yet a simple shift in the wind at the Battle of the Saints off Dominica in 1782, where Rodney was enabled to break through the line of French ships and ensure a victory that restored most of the colonies at the Treaty of Versailles the following year. So arbitrary is the fact that we are English-speaking islands today. Here we are trying to forge a union of islands that are similar only by chance in terms of language and political traditions. In 1871, Dominica was made a federal colony of the Leeward Islands against much local opposition. In 1876, Barbados was torn by the Confederation riots over proposals to include the island in a federation of the Windward Islands. In 1921, the Wood Commission report considered that federation was so unpopular it would be useless to try it. In 1932, a closer union commission was appointed by the British government to examine the possibilities of a federation of the islands. But its report shied away from federation and instead suggested a loose grouping of the Leeward and Windward Island colonies overseen by a governor, which, as it turns out, was a sort of prescription for a form of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States 50 years before its time. But the moment was missed. The disturbances of the 1930s and the Second World War intervened. So that was not until after the war that federation was considered once more. However, the social upheavals of the 1930s and the Second World War broke the momentum of what was started in 1932. In the meantime, in late 1938 and early 1939, the islands were visited by the Royal West India Commission under the chairmanship of Lord Moyne to investigate conditions in the colonies as a direct response to the riots, strikes, and demand for change that had swept the British West Indies in that decade. They reported, that was the commission, almost every witness thus questioned was in favor of closer union, but few of them were able or prepared to define the degree or nature of the federation which they conceived desirable. On the basis of their general impression, however, they doubted whether the time was yet ripe for the introduction of a large scheme for federation. Local pride, an active insularity, and the skepticism of well-informed opinion based on it made them doubt the readiness of West Indian opinion to accept the federation in principle. So many of these references we hear of even today, much more than 50 years afterwards. But when the war was over, in 1945, the federal agenda was once more put on the front burner. The first official federal conference was held in Montego Bay, Jamaica in 1947. By a majority vote, the delegates accepted the principle of political federation. The small islands, so-called, remained strong supporters of federation throughout the conferences and discussions, which paved the way to the Union. It was hoped that federation would give them some relief from their economic problems and add to their independence. The two large islands of Jamaica and Trinidad had serious doubts as to the benefits of federating with the lesser developed members of the group. Much of that sentiment remains today, particularly in trade issues in the context of CARICOM. Some of their countrymen felt that the smaller territories would be a drain on their more advanced economies. Although British Guyana, now Guyana, and British Honduras, now Belize, attended the conference, they decided not to join the federation. Jamaica and Trinidad finally agreed to participate in the planned union, and federal elections were held in 1958. The West Indies Federal Labour Party, consisting of political parties in each colony, secured a small majority in the Federal House of Representatives. The president of the party, Norman Manley of Jamaica, was the obvious choice for Prime Minister, but he preferred to remain as Premier of his own island, and so the post went to Grantley Adams of Barbados, the first and only Prime Minister of the Federation. He chose ministers for his cabinet who represented a cross-section of the island's interests. Unusually for the time, they included one woman minister, Phyllis Shand Alfrey. Even before the celebrations and fanfare had begun, failure seemed to loom over the new union. The choice of Governor-General in Lord Hales, a British peer, rather than an eminent West Indian, was an issue as well as the size and cost of his staff. The site for a capital caused considerable controversy. After debating over sites in Barbados, Jamaica, or Trinidad, it was finally decided that Chaguaramas, the site of a United States military base in Trinidad, should become the federal capital. The United States did not agree to give up the base, and Adams and the British government finally had to settle for Port Spain. This backing down in the face of United States refusal angered Premier Dr. Eric Williams of Trinidad, who said that it showed a weakness of national spirit in the new government. But there were even greater problems of unity itself. The practical details were and are overwhelming. The federal government had little funds to work with. There was an annual budget of scarcely more than $9 million of the Caribbean currency at the time, and this incidentally was less than the annual budget of the Port of Spain City Council. How were these funds to be distributed among islands, each with different local needs? There were conflicting interests among the states, which was weakening relations between the local governments and the federal government in Port of Spain. Questions arose about which government should collect the money raised from custom duties at each seaport and airport. Could West Indians enter each island of the Union freely as citizens of one united state? How could diverse trade unions and political parties be united? And it has been argued that there was apathy among the mass of the people. Local affairs took prominence over federal affairs, and independent island concerns were too strong for the ideal of unity. Jamaicans continued to be suspicious of the Federation because for them it created more problems than it solved. Alexander Bustamante continued to use the issue as a political weapon against Premier Norman Manley, and in 1961 he challenged Manley to hold a referendum. As was expected, the majority of Jamaicans voted against it, promoting the famous quote by Dr. Eric Williams, 1 from 10 leaves nothing. Jamaica therefore ended her association with the other islands. Manley resigned, general elections were held, and Bustamante was chosen to lead his country to independence in 1962. The government struggled on for a few more months after the referendum, but finally crashed in May 1962, after Dr. Eric Williams decided to remove Trinidad and Tobago and go independent later that year. The day the Federation of the West Indies was supposed to have become independent as one nation, May 31st, 1962, was the very day on which the Federation was formally dissolved. This was a great blow to West Indian idealists. For the first time, the most talented men and women in the Caribbean had gathered together to work as civil servants and ministers of government for the achievement of a common goal. Barely 3 years after its inception, the whole machinery of government had to be dismantled. Flags lowered, some state papers burnt, and others which have been kept in archives. Yet as one minister, Phyllis Allfrey, said at the last meeting of the Federal House of Representatives, some things are miserable failures, but we have tried our very best, and perhaps we could call this a noble failure. All of the island leaders who had sacrificed their careers on the altar of the Federation suffered politically when they returned home. All except for Robert Bradshaw of St. Kitts, who had rather cleverly chosen a non-Kittitian, the Dominican Paul Southwell, to keep his seat warm for him while he sat in the cabinet in Port of Spain. The demise of others was a double loss to the region. For a generation of leaders, Sir Grantley Adams among them, were thus relegated to political oblivion. So where do we go from here? Was the question which hung over the remnants of the Federation after its dissolution. The political leaders of the Windward and Leeward Islands and Barbados began to discuss plans for the formation of a federation of the 8 remaining islands, the Little 8. But after 4 years of more conferences, council sessions, and draft schemes, this attempt at unity also came to an end. Errol Barrow, the new Premier of Barbados, patiently nursed the possibility of Barbados membership of the group. Carefully, he balanced some Barbadian skepticism with the ideals of a union. But chief ministers such as V.C. Byrd of Antigua and Barbuda vacillated and delayed on minor topics, and Barrow finally had to tell them that he could wait no longer. Barbados became independent in November 1966, and the other islands sought further constitutional changes on their own. At a conference in London in 1966, plans were drawn up to make them individual, self-governing states in association with Britain, a system modeled somewhat on the Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands, called associated statehood. In 1967, the new status was given to Antigua, St. Kitts, Nevis, Anguilla, St. Lucia, Dominica, and Grenada. St. Vincent followed in 1969, but Montserrat remained a colony. Under associated statehood, each state was independent in all matters except defense and external affairs, for which Britain maintained responsibility. The states were to be free to end their association with Britain at any time, certain procedures. This move to factionalize nationalism was to delay any further attempt at unity for another 14 years, as each state scrambled to design their own flags, compose their own anthems, launch their own national radio stations, and conjure up all the usual paraphernalia of insular nationalism, which widened the gap between islands already separated by sea. There was even further splintering with the Anguilla Revolt of 1969, when the Anguillans protested that the central government in St. Kitts neglected them. Led by Ronald Webster, they seceded from the Union, demanding that they should become a British colony once more. Just as these political moves of separation were taking place, the foundation of CARIFTA in May 1968, which morphed into CARICOM on the 4th of July 1973, was seeking to revisit the need for bilateral agreements, particularly in relation to trade. In 1974, Grenada became the first associated state to gain independence, an event which was marked by violent unrest among political groups on the island. Few realized it as a precursor of a coup d'etat 5 years later. Other states moved towards nationhood more peacefully in the years that followed. Dominica became independent in 1978, and unlike the other associated states who had the Queen, Elizabeth II, as head of state, Dominica became a republic with its own president. St. Lucia and St. Vincent followed in 1979, Antigua and Barbuda in 1981, and St. Kitts and Nevis was the last associated state to gain full independence in September 1983. Even before that, the former associated states got together in Bastia to sign a treaty creating the Organization of Caribbean States in June. As a young member of Parliament, I was involved with Dominica's move to independence as a delegate at the Independence Conference in London in 1977. It was clear to us that the British government was cleaning out its colonial filing cabinets, as islands in the Caribbean and the Pacific were dispatched on their own in quick succession. When we were delaying and discussing aspects of the Dominica Constitution, the chairman, a guy from Wales called Evans Leward, was getting very impatient, and he said, you must realize, down the corridor, effectively, we have Kiribati, we have other islands in the Pacific, and we have St. Vincent and St. Lucia, so you really must hurry up. All of this came at a time of growing United States influence in the region, which had intensified from the time of the US bases on the islands during World War II. The Cold War tensions had intensified, already having been exacerbated by the Cuban Revolution of 1959, the Bay of Pigs fiasco, the missile crisis, and the embargo instituted by the US upon Cuba. All this increased political tensions in the Caribbean. In the English-speaking bloc, the effects of the Cold War erupted most dramatically in Grenada, and the OECS got its baptism by fire in assisting in resolving the crisis. In Sir Sridhar Ramphal's last speech in the Caribbean, before going to the Commonwealth Secretariat in 1975, a speech he called "To Care for CARICOM," he said this, and I quote, "A consequence of relative success over the last 10 years is a readiness to believe that unity is our natural state, one which will subsist despite ourselves. It is a dangerous falsehood. The history of colonialism and the geography of a scattered archipelago denies its validity. The natural state of our Caribbean is fragmentation. Without constant effort, without unrelenting perseverance and discipline in suppressing instincts born of tradition and environment, it is to our natural state of disunity that we shall return. Yet there is another side that is unifying, and it too is part of our natural state and of our natural heritage. It is the unmistakable, unchanging fact of a West Indian identity." Some skeptics would argue that it is quite possible to maintain a strong West Indian identity without being politically united. Indeed, a common law marriage with general agreements and understanding would be a genuinely Caribbean solution to the apparent hesitancy. So while we look back on the very uneven sea that we have traveled over the last 50 years to get to where we are today, we turn our sights to the future, where external and insular conditions seem as equally, or some would claim are even more precarious than those we have weathered so far. In fact, these islands, if you look at it very brutally and strip it down to the most basic, are the remnants of labor camps scattered up and down the islands from the days of the plantation. And the issues since emancipation have been how and what do you do with this massive labor force? In the 20th century, we have seen all of the workers' riots and conflicts of the 1930s, but also an attempt in the 20th century to convert that labor source into a better trained, more educated group that would be able to diversify from pure agricultural labor and manual labor of sorts to another form of society that would be able to attract investment from the international world. One of the things that we have to ensure is that our societies remain cosmopolitan and open and on the cutting edge. Some would consider, for instance, Holland in the 17th century, where, because it was a very open society for those times, where religious freedom was allowed, the minds, the best brains, the greatest investment of people like Jews, people like scientists, Protestants, people who wanted to, in effect, free their minds and expand their horizons, went to Holland and invested. And there was what was called the embarrassment of riches. Trinidad in the 19th century is another example. People left other parts of the Caribbean to come to Trinidad because of its cosmopolitan nature. Free people of color who were inhibited in their own colonies. People escaping from the revolution in Haiti. A number of groups decided to come to Trinidad. And the result of that was seen in the investment and the prosperity of Trinidad in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We hear talk up and down these islands about the Singapore model. But the Singapore model has as a prerequisite discipline and all of the other requirements of a state-of-the-art economic site. I will use an example, for instance, and I don't do this to drop names, of my maternal great-grandfather, who just over 100 years ago was the Attorney General of Singapore. And when he retired, he set up a legal company called Drew and Napier. And he said, I am not going to have self-satisfied Englishmen who simply believe that by their race they are going to be able to ensure their state in a job. We cannot develop this company or this colony in this manner. We must recruit the best brains that are available, and if they are from the region, all the better. There were young Indian lawyers coming in from British universities, Chinese from Canton and Shanghai and Hong Kong, and others from the Malay states. The company Drew and Napier exists today. You can Google it on the internet. And it is this demand for efficiency that creates that model that we hear so often about. The other aspect, of course, is education. And the University of the West Indies, along, some would say, with the West Indies cricket team, is one of the survivors through those 50 years and more. But unfortunately, we have the problem that is occurring within many of our states, where even the community colleges are now creating themselves as proto-universities and issuing Bachelor of Science degrees, as we just issued in Dominica. Basically also making arrangements with what I would consider third-rate American universities with programs that would link the community center, the community colleges, directly with them. This causes a situation where governments are divided by their commitment in terms of support of funds to their local community colleges to develop them as these universities, and their commitment to the University of the West Indies. This is a serious division that is taking place up and down the Caribbean, as even the university system is fractured and becomes separate. But yet, you need some kind of philosophy to guide a nation. The leadership that we would have had in the Federation days is not the same. That commitment to the spirit of the Enlightenment, the 18th century concept that helped to abolish slavery, that helped to build nations like the United States, and that is in effect influenced all of our various constitutions. That spirit of the Enlightenment is weakening in our nation states. Since 1945, as I mentioned, there's the growing influence of the United States. And since, for many people, aspects of their philosophy is rooted in religion, we have seen, since the war, the growth of fundamentalism within the Caribbean nations. And fundamentalism essentially is anti-scientific and anti-intellectual. And it is a growing force within our communities, and the politicians realize this. And the pastors realize it too. So what is developing is politicians almost beholden to large swathes of the population who are fundamentalists, and fundamentalist leaders realizing that they hold a key position within the political balance of these countries. I don't say this as a criticism, I just observe it from an anthropological point of view as a reality within our states today. And what I fear is that just like the Midwest Bible Belt of the United States, just as we have seen in the Tea Party in the US and large swathes of the Republican Party, that it in effect dumbs down the population. And with a population that is not, as I said, scientific, is anti-intellectual, you are going to really cripple some of the best that your country can produce. The other aspect of this philosophy and human resources is the drive to materialism, a crass, almost ghettoized materialism that is being copied from the United States. I won't go into too much detail, but simply to say that one of the great manifestations in the last year of this kind of materialism is the shocking development with Clico and British American in all of our states, which has sucked from our countries millions of dollars that would have been there for investment in development. It has also shattered the lives of some of the older people within our countries who placed all their retirement benefits with these companies. And heartlessly, that money has been spirited away. I know here in Trinidad, efforts are being made to solve the issue, and also in Barbados. But generally, those people have been left on their own to form groups, find lawyers, try to piece back their lives, which many of them will never, ever be able to do. This is a form of materialism that is blind and brutal and does nothing to enhance the reputation of our countries to the wider world and to international investment. Of course, we received maximum publicity from the affair of Alan Stanford, which was, although a foreign matter, but it was deeply ingrained and related to the Caribbean. And so we have these aspects around us which we really have to deal with. And if we claim that we want this efficient Singapore model that will attract international investment and make us a major player in world economics, we have to be very careful of the way we handle this. The other aspect is food security and agriculture. This neglect of agriculture, which of course is related to the fact of the plantation and the reluctance of people to be seen to be working in the field or to be involved in any way with that type of production, is a serious blow to us. Because food security is going to increasingly become a serious matter, particularly in nations like ours that import so much of their food. Next year, apparently the prices of foodstuffs from North America are going to go up as a result of recent droughts, and the cost of any of the wheat and corn products and all of the things related to it, tin stuff for instance, are going to have a serious impact on some of the basic imports into this country. Thankfully, there are persons like Leonard Ogaro of St. Vincent and the University of the West Indies, one of our laureates of this year, who is working, one of the very few who is working scientifically to ensure the continued development of our foodstuffs. In energy, we have Mr. Husbands and examples that he has presented to us of solar power, not only in terms of heating water, but in terms of producing electricity. I don't usually promote things unless I have tried them myself. My home in Dominica is entirely solar powered, and it has been so for 14 years. For 14 years I have not paid a light bill, and it has covered everything. But that is by getting in touch with persons who want to be on the cutting edge of this technology. We face the northeastern trade winds, and wind generation in some territories, particularly in the French territories, is well advanced. These are areas that we should consider. In aspects of trade, this is one of the areas where CARICOM is having some of the biggest issues. The conflict in trade and the sharing of trade between Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. The fact that Jamaica is making deals with places, for instance, like Mexico and other countries in Central America that are not necessarily done in cooperation with the rest of the countries. Just as Trinidad and Tobago is developing important relationships with Brazil and other Latin American countries in South America. So the problem is, how do you coordinate this? My fellow countryman, Urin Larocque, General Secretary of CARICOM, is kind of between a rock and a hard place, trying to coordinate a rather unwieldy bureaucracy that is supposed to be advancing Caribbean unity and is swamped by a number of responsibilities on many levels and is in fact creating an impatience among certain OECS leaders. And then in terms of tourism, we have all of the related matters that I earlier spoke of in relation to efficiency, discipline, and service. Constantly we hear references to this, but how effective is it in actual fact in the marketplace across our regions? What we also face in the years ahead is the opening up of Cuba. That is, of the United States lifting the embargo. The tourism of the Eastern Caribbean from 1959 was a result of, in a way, the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution and the embargo put on by the US shut down Cuba, and tourism from North America shifted first to the Bahamas and the development of Freeport, etc., and then down into the Eastern Caribbean. If at any time the United States decides to lift the embargo, we know where the mass tourism will go to. 40% cheaper, at least for now, and should probably be able to maintain rates. Beaches and attractions that would rival anything in the Eastern Caribbean. These are things to consider when we look at the future. And the environmental matters related to our countries cross borders. Not only do they cross CARICOM borders, they cross borders with the French territories, the Dutch territories, and the Spanish Caribbean. And they must be dealt with as a whole, as a cross-border. I will leave with some of these ideas. I'll end with some of these aspects. As slowly we notice the leaders of the OECS in the Eastern Caribbean raising some concern, a tone of impatience with CARICOM, and a sense of urgency with the OECS mission. Just two newspaper reports. Leaders from the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States and the heads of affiliated territories have opened the OECS Assembly in Antigua by issuing strong warning that the group should not be allowed to falter, as appears to be the case with the Caribbean community, CARICOM. Ralph Gonzalez, the Vincentian leader, noted that the sub-region has made immense progress since 1981, signing the original Treaty of Bastille that established the 9-member OECS, noting that challenges abound. And I quote, "We are currently on pause in CARICOM in its quest for a single economy. I want us to avoid all of these kinds of reversals in the OECS. And that is why I urge above all we must do and care for the OECS. It is our anchor in the dangerous regional and global communities," unquote. Just a few days ago in Barbados, Kenny Anthony was speaking on a similar vein. And I quote, "It is imperative that the role of CARICOM evolves, not only to keep up with the times, but to shape the times in which we live. This is the view put forward by St. Lucia Prime Minister and current chairman of CARICOM, Dr. Kenny Anthony, during a Barbados Chamber of Commerce and Industry luncheon on Wednesday, the 31st of October, 2012. And I quote, "CARICOM cannot seem to be impotent when societies and economies are at risk on the brink of collapse. The Caribbean is and has been for too long stalled at a crossroad of indecision, stalled so long that we are in danger of becoming out of step with the rest of the world." I could end on a note, as so many people do, a romantic illusion of the wonderful joint and linking Caribbean. It's something that we repeat over and over again. It's a sort of ideal that has been going since the days of Père Labat in the 17th century, when he has this wonderful passage about all the islands being one and the flow of the sea from shore to shore. But the reality, of course, is very different. As Kenny Anthony has said, time is passing. Ralph Gonzalez, the Prime Minister of Dominica, how long do we have to wait for CARICOM when we in the OECS have already set up an assembly, elected a speaker, and begun a political aspect of unity? And so, having reviewed the Federation and a number of the issues that emerged as challenges in the 1950s, and reflecting that many of those challenges are the same that we have today, that we have not overcome in 50 years, and realizing that, unfortunately, in many aspects, CARICOM has become an overburdened and weighty bureaucracy that is moving too slowly for the realities that are occurring in our states, and realizing that the OECS, being made up of very similar people, is a leaner, more swifter machine, sharing a currency already, and many other aspects of connections, particularly in terms of our Supreme Court and other links that have been established for many, many years. I simply say this, that it is likely in the years ahead that we shall see the more rapid evolution of the OECS, small as that entity may be, while the two larger, and perhaps you could even say the three larger, to include Guyana, who was not a member of the original federation, plod along, attempting to come to terms with their powerful positions at each end of our beloved archipelago. Thank you all very much. Good night.